All right, what's going on, you guys? Nick here with Nick's Strength and Power. So I wanted to make a video about a bodybuilder who I believe is one of the most underrated classic physiques of all time. So this bodybuilder's name is Freddy Ortiz, and we are going way back in bodybuilding history looking at this guy because he competed primarily in the 70s. And I think for the 1970s, his physique was far ahead of its time. If you look at this particular photo right here, where he's hitting this front double bicep, I think his front double bicep pose was one of the most aesthetic and classic front double bicep poses to ever come out of that era. I mean, if you look at the development of the biceps peaks, the overall width of his lats in that front double bicep pose, the smallness of his waist, and his ability to hit that vacuum during the front double bicep makes it one of the most aesthetically pleasing front double biceps, I think, to come out of that era. So the interesting thing about Freddy, and the reason I think not a whole lot of people really know about him, is the fact that he competed primarily before the Mr. Olympia competition even became a thing. So a lot of the bodybuilders that we look back on are guys that have won the Mr. Olympia or placed well in the Mr. Olympia, or guys that were the stars of the IFBB. Now, Freddy Ortiz competed primarily in the early 60s, so it's important to keep in mind that the Mr. Olympia competition was not created until 1965. So prior to 1965, you had Freddy Ortiz win some of his best titles ever. The 1962 IFBB Mr. Universe, he won the short division. The 1963 IFBB Mr. America, he won the short division there. Then in 64, he would repeat and win the Mr. America title again in the short division. And then in 1966, he would win the IFBB Mr. Eastern America, the short division as well. So 66 would be the first show that he would do after the Mr. Olympia. And then he would go on to compete in 68, where his placings would drop a little bit. He would do the WBBG Mr. America, where he would only place second. And he would also do the NABA Mr. Universe, where he would only place second. Then his final show in 1969, he did the WBBG Mr. America, and he placed third. So all of his best placings were really prior to the Mr. Olympia. So I think at that point in time, when the Mr. Olympia started to take over and that became, really the show to win, that was when he was in his prime. So he probably wasn't really getting the recognition he deserved, because at that point in time, I think the focus was starting to turn to this new Mr. Olympia competition, and not so much the Mr. Americas and the Mr. Universes. So there's kind of a paradigm shift at that point in time. So Freddy Ortiz was a Puerto Rican bodybuilder. He was actually born in Puerto Rico, but his family moved to New York City at the age of 18. Back in 1959, and 1 year later in 1960, he would do his first ever bodybuilding show after seeing a magazine with Reg Park on the cover that inspired him to compete, because he always had an athletic build as a kid. So his first show ever was a 1960 Mr. New York City, which he placed second at against a very competitive lineup. Then he would go on to compete in those Mr. America and Mr. Universe and much higher level shows. And it's also important to remember, when he was competing at these IFBB Mr. America and Mr. Universes, he was competing against guys like Larry Scott, who would win the first ever Olympia. He was competing against guys like Franco Colombo, Danny Padilla, and he was beating these guys at these shows. So some of the biggest legends in the IFBB that would go on to compete in the Olympia, unlike Freddy Ortiz, he was beating these guys in shows. So that just goes to speak to what a legend he really was of this sport. So like I mentioned earlier in the video, his ability to hit these classic poses was exacerbated by the fact that he had these massive thick lats that made these classic poses look incredibly impressive on him. And he pulled off some of these poses in a way that I haven't seen any other bodybuilders of that era pull them off, because of the taper effect that he was able to achieve with those lats and with that tiny waist, and the vacuum effect that he was able to pull off as well. Those vacuum poses with those twisted front double biceps and those front-facing front double biceps as well. So at the peak of his bodybuilding career, he competed between 185 and 195 pounds, or between 83.9 and 88.5 kilograms, and he sported a 27-inch waist. So that speaks to how tiny his waist was. His arms were about 20 inches, his chest was about 50. So you can imagine the effect of that 50-inch chest with that 27-inch waist, the V-taper effect that would have. Now 185 to 195 might not sound like that heavy of a bodybuilder, but Freddy Ortiz was only 5'6" tall, or 167.5 centimeters tall. So he was not a very tall guy. So 185 to 195 was pretty heavy for a guy that height, especially in the era that he competed in the 1960s. So Freddie is still alive today at the age of 76, and this guy is a perfect example of bodybuilders with incredible physiques that somehow seem to become forgotten or lost over time. That's kind of the purpose of my channel. I want to bring back some attention to some of these guys that a lot of people have never heard of, maybe don't remember, and especially the younger generation that's watching my videos. I'd be willing to bet a lot of these guys have never heard of or seen Freddy Ortiz. And this is really why the classic physique division is taking off today, is because when we look back at physiques like this is how a lot of guys want to look. It's a realistic looking physique. It's a aesthetically pleasing looking physique, and it's not this big, freaky mass monster physique like we see today with bodybuilding. And that's where classic physique really came from. So I think it's important to kind of show the history of some of these guys with those classic physiques. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Please give it a thumbs up if you did enjoy it. Nick Strength and Power, signing out.